April 1943. The skies over France, sharp and clear at 27,000 feet. German ace Ralph Herrmann scans the horizon from his Focke-Wulf. Below, a formation of American fighters claws upward through the thin air. They look big, slow, awkward, their wings too short, their engines strained, almost comical against the blue. He laughs into his radio. Flying milk bottles. What he doesn't know is that history has just shifted. Those ungainly machines, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, will soon become the most feared fighters in Europe. In less than 2 years, they'll rip apart the Luftwaffe, smash German supply lines, and prove that American industry can turn ridicule into ruin. The joke is airborne, and it's about to change the war. The year was 1940. France had fallen. Britain stood alone. Across the Atlantic, the United States faced a grim truth. If war came, it needed a fighter that could climb higher, hit harder, and face the best the world could build. Republic Aviation got the call. Chief designer Alexander Kartveli knew speed and altitude were the keys. What he created was unlike anything in Europe's skies. Not elegant, not sleek, but massive. The P-47 Thunderbolt pushed the limits of single-engine design. Empty, it weighed nearly 10,000 pounds. In its nose sat the new Pratt & Whitney Double Wasp, a radial engine with 18 cylinders, cranking out 2,000 horsepower. Exhaust gases fed a turbo-supercharger buried deep in the fuselage, forcing power even in thin air. The result? A machine so oversized it earned the nickname Jug, short for juggernaut. Pilots were wary. The Thunderbolt rolled dangerously. On takeoff, dove into compressibility where controls locked solid and ground-looped during landings. Between autumn of '42 and spring of '43, accidents killed dozens before the plane ever saw combat. But hidden beneath that heavy skin was a secret, an engine that held power at 30,000 feet, a frame built like armor plate, and wings, armed with 8 machine guns, each carrying enough rounds to outlast any dogfight. This was no duelist's blade. It was a hammer, waiting for the battlefield. April 1943. The Thunderbolt entered combat over Europe. Morale was shaky. Many American pilots had only just crossed the Atlantic. Their enemy, the Luftwaffe, had years of hard-earned experience. Poland, France, Britain, Russia. Now they waited for rookies flying machines that looked more like bombers than fighters. The first clashes went badly. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs climbed faster, turned tighter, and punished every mistake. Pilots trained on the Spitfire looked at the P-47 with open skepticism. Too large, too heavy, too slow to survive against German aces. Losses piled up. In the first month alone, 14 Thunderbolts were destroyed in combat. In return, only 3 victories were claimed. German confidence soared. They mocked the new fighter, calling it a flying milk bottle, even a pregnant cow. Even Britain's allies had their doubts. From their Spitfire squadrons, they joked that the safest evasive maneuver in a Thunderbolt was simply running laps around its roomy cockpit. But inside those early defeats was a clue no one recognized yet. The aircraft that went down fell reluctantly. Engines that should have seized kept grinding forward. Airframes that should have shattered held together long enough to bring men home. The Luftwaffe thought the Americans had brought a bludgeon to a fencing match. They had, and soon that blunt instrument would prove deadly. Whispers began to spread among the American squadrons. The Thunderbolt wasn't quick to climb. It wasn't graceful in a turn. But it was nearly impossible to kill. Pilots limped home, in machines so torn apart that ground crews shook their heads in disbelief. One P-47 returned with more than 20 cannon strikes and over 100 bullet holes stitched across its skin. Another landed safely, despite 3 of its 4 main fuselage beams being severed. The secret lay in the engine. German and British fighters relied on liquid cooling. One strike to a radiator, one burst through a coolant line, and the fight was over. The Thunderbolt's massive Pratt & Whitney radial was air-cooled, rugged, and stubborn. It could be riddled with holes and still run strong enough to get a pilot home. Armor plate shielded the cockpit. A thick bulletproof windscreen protected the pilot's face. Control cables were duplicated, so even if one set was shredded, the other could take over. Layer by layer, the jug was designed to keep men alive. For the Luftwaffe, this meant frustration. For the Americans, it meant something far more powerful: confidence. Confidence that even if they made mistakes, their machine would forgive them. Confidence that gave pilots the courage to fight differently, and that change would tilt the skies of Europe. By mid-1943, American pilots understood a hard truth. Dogfighting the Luftwaffe was suicide. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulfs 190 were built for sudden climbs and tight turns. The Thunderbolt was not, so the pilots changed the rules. They stopped fighting on German terms and started fighting on their own. At 30,000 feet, the P-47 came alive. Its turbo-supercharged engine delivered sea-level strength where German engines gasped for air. From that height, the tactic was simple and devastating: roll over, dive, fire, and climb back into the heavens. In a dive, nothing in Europe could match it. The Thunderbolt's sheer weight pulled it down like a hammer, quickly breaking 500 miles per hour. German fighters tried to follow, only to lose control, buffeted, shaken apart by the strain. The jug didn't care. It dove like a falling anvil. At the bottom, the pilot squeezed the triggers. 8 heavy Brownings spat a solid stream of fire, converging into a 6-foot circle of destruction. Fighters shredded. Bombers disintegrated. Anything caught inside was erased before the enemy could react. Then, just as quickly, the Thunderbolt zoomed back upward, carried by raw horsepower, untouchable. No circling duels, no wasted energy, just sudden strikes, delivered with overwhelming force. Pilots called it boom and zoom. German survivors called it something else: a wall of lead. The Thunderbolt had found its method. It no longer needed to turn with the enemy. It only needed to fall on them like thunder. The moment that defined the Thunderbolt came on June 26, 1943. Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron flew escort over France. He was at the rear of the formation, the most vulnerable spot. Within seconds, cannon shells smashed into his P-47. The canopy shattered. Oil sprayed across the windscreen, blinding him. The engine shook violently. Shrapnel tore into his legs. The controls barely responded. Johnson tried to bail out, but the canopy was jammed, twisted shut by a shell burst. He was trapped inside a dying machine at 27,000 feet. Then a German fighter closed in. Its cannon and machine guns hammered the Thunderbolt again and again. Johnson ducked behind his armor plate, waiting for the blast that would end him, but it never came. The jug refused to fall. The German made another pass, emptied his guns. Still, the Thunderbolt stayed airborne. Finally, the enemy pulled alongside, close enough for Johnson to see his face. The expression said everything: disbelief, frustration, and then, almost, respect. The German raised a hand in salute and peeled away. Out of ammunition, out of answers. Against all odds, Johnson coaxed the wreck home across the channel. On the runway, ground crews stopped counting after 200 holes, and yet, somehow, the Thunderbolt had delivered its pilot back alive. The Thunderbolt's firepower wasn't just strong, it was overwhelming. 4 Browning heavy machine guns in each wing. 8 in total. More than 3,000 rounds carried into every mission. In the air, that meant sustained firepower no German fighter could match. Their cannons were powerful but limited, often just a handful of seconds before the magazines ran dry. A Thunderbolt pilot could hold the trigger for half a minute, filling the sky with tracers. At convergence range, the 8 streams overlapped into a circle barely 6 feet wide. Anything inside that circle didn't just fall, it ceased to exist. Twin-engine interceptors designed to smash bomber formations were shredded in seconds, and altitude gave the jug an advantage the enemy never expected. At 30,000 feet, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs lost strength. Their engines gasped, their wings faltered. The Thunderbolt did not. Turbocharged, It kept its full weight of guns, its climb and its dive, ready to strike again and again. The rhythm of the air war began to change. Bomber crews who once looked out to see desperate dogfights below now watched with relief as Thunderbolts dove down like falling anvils, tore the enemy apart, and climbed back to guard them. For the first time, Germany's Air Force faced an opponent that did not just fight, it outlasted. And in the high skies where the war's future would be decided, the P-47 Thunderbolt turned air combat into something brutally one-sided. Late in 1943, the Thunderbolt received a vital upgrade. A massive paddle blade propeller, 13 feet across, was fitted to bite deeper into the air. The effect was immediate. Climb rate jumped. Acceleration surged. The heavy fighter that once lagged behind could now rise almost as quickly as its opponents. German pilots who expected to outclimb the jug suddenly found it keeping pace, sometimes even pushing higher into the thin, icy stratosphere. And then there was the sound. At full power, the giant blades spun so fast their tips brushed the edge of the sound barrier. The result was a rolling, thunderous roar that echoed across towns and fields long before the aircraft itself appeared. To German ground troops, it became a warning bell of death. They froze at the sound, knowing what followed: strafing runs, bombs, rockets, and the hammering fury of 8 heavy guns. They gave it a name: the thunderclap. What had begun as laughter in the spring of 1943 had, by winter, become something darker. The mere presence of the Thunderbolt overhead carried a weight of fear that spread across the front. By early 1944, the Mustang was pushing deep into Germany, escorting bombers all the way to their targets. Freed from the longest missions, the Thunderbolt discovered a new role, one that fit its size and power perfectly: ground attack. The fighter became a bomber. Its wings carried brutal loads, 2 1,000-pound bombs, or racks of rockets that struck like flying artillery. Combined with 8 machine guns, the Jug could smash anything it found. The effect on German movement was devastating. Truck convoys disappeared in minutes. Tanks erupted in fireballs under armor-piercing incendiary rounds. Locomotives exploded, rail lines twisted into scrap, bridges collapsed into rivers. Soldiers on the ground learned to scatter at the first distant growl of its engine. On D-Day, Thunderbolts flew more than 500 missions over the beaches. German pilots who broke through the flak met a wall of American fighters at every altitude. Survivors said the sky itself felt locked shut. Layer upon layer of Thunderbolts, and for the German army on the ground, the picture was worse. Divisions stalled, starved of fuel and ammunition, paralyzed under relentless attack. By the end of June, Allied reports credited the Thunderbolt with thousands of destroyed vehicles, hundreds of tanks, and entire supply networks wiped away. The airplane once mocked as a flying milk bottle had become something far more terrifying: flying artillery, a hammer from the sky, striking wherever roads, railways, or convoys dared to move. The Thunderbolt's story was not only written in the skies, it was forged on the factory floor. Republic Aviation and its partner plants built more than 15,000 P-47s. At the peak, one rolled off the assembly line every single hour. Engines, ammunition, and spare parts crossed the Atlantic in endless convoys. For the Americans, this meant resilience. A squadron could lose planes on Monday and fly replacements by Friday. Damaged aircraft were repaired, scrapped, or replaced without slowing operations. Fuel and ammunition arrived in such abundance that Thunderbolt pilots trained with live fire far more than their opponents ever could. The Luftwaffe lived the opposite reality. German factories staggered under relentless bombing. Resources dwindled. Every aircraft lost was harder to replace. Every pilot killed was irreplaceable. Training hours shrank until young Germans entered combat with barely 100 hours in the cockpit. Their American counterparts arrived with 4 times that experience. The war in the air was no longer balanced. It had become a contest of endurance, and the Thunderbolt embodied that imbalance: tough in the sky, endless on the production line, and backed by an industrial might Germany could never match. Late in 1944, a new shadow crossed Europe's skies. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It tore through bomber formations at speeds no propeller aircraft could match. To German pilots, it seemed like salvation. To the Allies, it looked like a desperate gamble. The Thunderbolt, slower in level flight, could not chase the jet across open sky, but American pilots adapted. They struck when the Me-262 was most vulnerable, during takeoff, landing, or when it throttled back to attack bombers. From altitude, Thunderbolts dove at near supersonic speed, closing the gap long enough to unleash their devastating firepower. Jets fell, not to elegance, but to discipline, tactics, and sheer numbers. The Luftwaffe had placed its hopes in a miracle weapon, but miracles demand time, fuel, and pilots. By late 1944, Germany had none to give. Against Thunderbolts and Mustangs, even the future could not change the outcome. While the Thunderbolt carved its legend in Europe, it also fought in a very different arena, the Pacific. Here distances were vast, weather was brutal, airstrips were hacked from jungle and coral. The Jug adapted. Later variants carried fuel in wet wings, extending their reach to more than 2,000 miles. With that range, Thunderbolts escorted B-29s and struck deep into enemy territory. In New Guinea, the Philippines, and later over Japan, the P-47 showed the same ferocity that terrified the Luftwaffe. Its 8 heavy Brownings shredded Japanese aircraft, built for agility but not endurance. Its armor shrugged off hits that would have destroyed lighter American fighters, and with bombs and rockets slung beneath its wings, it became flying artillery, pounding islands where ground troops fought yard by yard. Japanese pilots who once trusted speed and nimbleness found themselves outmatched by an opponent that simply refused to break. In the Pacific, as in Europe, the Thunderbolt proved it could thrive anywhere the war demanded. By the final year of the war, the Thunderbolt had earned its place in history. In Europe alone, P-47s destroyed thousands of enemy aircraft in combat, thousands more on the ground, and laid waste to Germany's rail network and armored divisions. In June 1944 alone, Thunderbolts claimed more than 600 locomotives and nearly 4,000 trucks. But the true legacy was larger than numbers. The P-47 proved that a fighter did not need to be graceful to win. It needed to be reliable, survivable, powerful, and built in such numbers that no setback could stop it. For bomber crews, the Thunderbolt meant safety overhead. For ground troops, it meant fire support when the road ahead was blocked. For German soldiers, its roar meant that nowhere in daylight was secure. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, collapsed under the combined weight of Allied production and firepower. The P-47 was not the only weapon that broke it, but it was one of the most decisive. What had begun as a machine of mockery ended as a symbol of inevitability. Heavy, loud, indestructible. The Thunderbolt buried the Luftwaffe under steel and fire. The P-47 Thunderbolt entered the war as a joke, mocked for its bulk and awkward shape. It ended as thunder from the skies, a weapon that shattered the Luftwaffe, crippled supply lines, and proved that American industry could not be outmatched. But this is only one story from the greatest conflict in history. More battles, more machines, more untold moments await. If you want to see the full story of World War II unfold, subscribe and join us for the next episode.